When you look at a royal portrait, what you see appears divine, flawless bloodlines, perfect genetics, rulers seemingly chosen by God himself. These figures seem to embody perfection, power, wealth, and every privilege the world could offer. Yet what you're truly seeing is a carefully painted illusion. The most powerful royal dynasty in Europe didn't simply decline, they dismantled themselves from within. Their so-called pure bloodline became so corrupted that their final monarch couldn't close his mouth, chew food, or even produce an heir. The sight of his birth was so horrifying that his own mother recoiled in shock. But before Charles II of Spain became a medical wonder, a man whose jaw jutted out so far he constantly drooled, whose body failed him in every basic function, he was heir to the greatest empire on earth. His story stands as one of the rare historical records that reveal what happens when human ambition pushes genetics past the limits of nature. Modern geneticists who studied his DNA found something beyond comprehension. Charles II was more inbred than a child born to parents who were siblings. What follows is a tale as tragic as it is terrifying, the story of how the mightiest dynasty on the planet transformed its own lineage into a biological catastrophe. Picture the Royal Palace of Madrid, November 6, 1661. The chamber is dimly lit, the air heavy with the cries of newborn life. Midwives have just delivered the heir to the Spanish throne, but dread ripples through the room. The baby's head is grotesquely swollen, his breath ragged. The official records are polite, but behind those words lies something darker. His mother, Queen Mariana, reportedly shuddered at the sight of her child and refused to nurse him, not out of cruelty, but out of instinctive horror. Because Queen Mariana wasn't just his mother, she was also his cousin and his aunt. That impossible truth existed because her husband, King Philip IV, had married his own niece. If you're trying to picture that family tree, don't bother, it isn't a tree. It's a perfect circle. To understand how such a child could be born so broken, we must travel further back to the origins of a dynasty that believed keeping power meant keeping it in the blood. The Habsburgs had a motto: let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. It sounds poetic until you realize they meant marrying each other. For nearly 2 centuries, the Spanish Habsburgs had sealed alliances not through diplomacy but through incest, cousins marrying cousins, uncles marrying nieces, even double first cousins uniting as husband and wife. They called it maintaining the purity of blood. Science calls it genetic self-destruction. Here's a number that defies belief. More than 80% of Spanish Habsburg marriages were between close relatives, not distant relations, but people who shared grandparents and sometimes even parents. By the time Charles II was born, all 8 of his great-grandparents descended from the same pair, Philip I and Joanna of Castile. Every single one. Modern DNA analysis estimates Charles's inbreeding coefficient, meaning the percentage of genes inherited from identical ancestors, 0.254. To put that into perspective, a child of brother and sister parents has a coefficient of 0.25. Charles, too, was more inbred than a child of siblings. Yet these numbers fail to capture the true human cost. Imagine what this meant for a living child. Baby Charles couldn't feed properly. His tiny mouth already displayed signs of deformity, his skull uneven and swollen, the bones failing to fuse as they should. Royal doctors noted his weak ability to suckle, an ominous sign in an age without infant formula. The wet nurses tasked with feeding him soon noticed something even more unsettling. The infant rarely cried. not out of peace, but exhaustion. He lay still and pale, his oversized head drooping to one side, his breath shallow and strained. The finest physicians in Spain could find no cure, no precedent for what they witnessed. As he grew, the extent of his suffering became undeniable. At 4 years old, Charles still could not walk, not because he refused, but because he physically couldn't. His legs were thin, frail, bent by rickets, unable to hold his own body. Servants had to carry the heir to the Spanish throne everywhere in specially built chairs. The boy who would rule an empire had to be carried like an infant, and it only worsened. By the age of 4, he still hadn't spoken a single word. His tongue had already begun to swell abnormally, filling his mouth, while his jaw, the infamous Habsburg jaw, pushed forward grotesquely. When he finally uttered his first words after his 4th birthday, they came out slurred, wet, and almost unintelligible. The royal chroniclers politely wrote that His Majesty's speech required interpretation. In truth, Charles's tongue was so large it hung permanently from his mouth. His lower jaw extended so far that his lips could never meet, forcing saliva to constantly spill from his mouth. Attendants stood nearby with silk cloths to wipe the drool from the chin of the child king. The Habsburg jaw, if you've never seen it, imagine taking a normal human skull, grabbing the lower jaw and pulling it several inches forward, while the upper jaw stays the same. The result, a mouth that can never close, teeth that never align, and a tongue that has no room to rest. In royal portraits, painters did their best to disguise it, often showing Charles with his mouth just slightly open, as if caught mid-sentence. The truth was far less dignified. His mouth was permanently ajar because it could not physically close. Foreign envoys meeting the young prince for the first time often had to summon all their discipline not to react. One French diplomat confessed in private letters that the prince's appearance defied description. His jaw, he wrote, jutted so far forward it gave the illusion of 2 faces, one layered upon the other. When he attempted to eat, morsels tumbled from his mouth, and when he spoke, one had to stand back to avoid the spray. And then there was eating itself, an ordeal beyond comprehension. Charles could not chew. Imagine that for a moment. Every single meal of his life, from childhood until his dying day, he was forced to swallow food whole like a bird. His upper and lower teeth were separated by such a gulf that they never touched. Dining at court became a spectacle of improvisation. Meat had to be minced into tiny fragments. Vegetables were mashed to pulp. Bread was soaked in wine until it dissolved into mush. The English ambassador, Alexander Stanhope, wrote one of the most vivid accounts. His Catholic Majesty swallows whatever he eats whole, for his lower jaw protrudes so far that his teeth cannot meet. To make up for this, he possesses a monstrous appetite, consuming an entire lamb across 2 meals. Yet his grotesque deformities were only the beginning. As Charles grew old, rather failed to grow, fresh ailments emerged. He seemed a magnet for sickness. Measles nearly took him at the age of 6. Then came chickenpox, leaving him scarred, followed by rubella, then smallpox. Each epidemic that passed through Madrid found an easy victim in the frail prince, whose feeble immune system mounted little defense. The smallpox outbreak was especially cruel. It struck when Charles was 9 years old and kept him hovering between life and death for weeks. His face, already disfigured, became a battlefield of sores and scabs. When the boy finally pulled through, the scars merely joined the long list of his imperfections. But the illness left behind something more insidious. The royal physicians noted a buildup of fluid within his skull. His already enlarged head began to swell further. Today, we would call it hydrocephalus water on the brain. In the 17th century, it was spoken of as yet another divine punishment. The mounting pressure brought searing headaches, blurred vision, and likely fueled the seizures that would torment him later in life. By the time he turned 10, his education had become the shame of the royal household, not because the prince was stubborn or unwilling, but because he simply could not learn. His tutors lamented that lessons had to be repeated endlessly. Arithmetic eluded him entirely. Latin, the language of rulers and diplomacy, might as well have been an indecipherable code. His handwriting, when he attempted it, resembled the scrawl of a much younger child. One tutor's private notes, uncovered centuries later, offer a heartbreaking glimpse. His Majesty strives with effort, yet retains nothing. I explain, and by the next day, it is as though he never heard it. His thoughts drift. At times, he sits in silence, staring into nothingness. When questioned on his reflections, he cannot answer. But as bleak as this seemed, worse was yet to come. When Charles reached the age of adolescence, or what should have been adolescence, his body betrayed him anew. His frame lengthened, but only slightly, as if reluctant to grow at all. While other royal youths grew tall and strong, Charles remained frail and undersized. His voice never deepened but stayed sharp and childlike, and his face barely showed a trace of hair. The signs that mark a boy's transition into manhood simply never appeared. The royal doctors gathered in private, whispering about what they had observed but never daring to record it officially. The young prince showed no attraction toward women or men. He existed in a strange, suspended state, neither boy nor man, a mystery that filled the court with fear. After all, Charles had one sacred duty above all else: to secure an heir. The vast Spanish Empire, stretching across Europe, the Americas, and the Philippines, depended on him to continue the royal bloodline. But how could a man who couldn't even grow a proper beard be expected to father a child? At 18, the court decided to test fate. Charles was married to Marie-Louise of Orleans, a 17-year-old French princess celebrated for her beauty, grace, and intelligence. The difference between the two was almost cruel. She was radiant. He looked ghostly. Marie-Louise floated down the aisle with elegance, while Charles shuffled awkwardly, supported by attendants. When it came time for the ceremonial kiss, witnesses noticed her hesitation. She had to gather her courage before leaning in. That night, the royal wedding turned into a tragedy. Not the sort of awkward misfortune that makes for amusing gossip, but a failure that threatened the future of an empire. It became painfully clear that Charles was not unwilling. He was simply incapable. His body refused to perform the duties expected of a husband and king. Marie-Louise, raised among the sophistication of the French court, tried everything. She was patient, gentle, and, according to rumor, even attempted to guide her husband through the fundamentals of marital intimacy. Yet nothing worked. The years went by, and still there was no sign of a child. When suspicion turned toward her, the young queen was subjected to degrading medical examinations. The doctors announced she was perfectly healthy, fertile, even. Everyone knew where the true problem lay, but none dared to say it aloud. The weight of expectation grew unbearable. Desperation set in. Both Charles and Marie-Louise were subjected to bizarre fertility cures. She was forced to drink revolting mixtures of herbs and animal parts, while Charles was made to swallow concoctions containing powdered pearls and bull's blood. A so-called specialist even suggested he eat the dried genitals of a stag. Nothing worked because nothing could. Charles's body, including his reproductive system, was as misshapen as his face. But the story only grows stranger. His mother, desperate to preserve the Habsburg dynasty, turned to mystics and holy men for answers. One told her that Charles was under a curse, that he must sleep beside sacred relics to lift it. When that failed, she took the horror a step further. The queen ordered her son to sleep beside corpses. Yes, you heard that correctly. She had him lie next to the exhumed bodies of saints and former kings. Even his own father, believing that the holiness of the dead might restore his manhood. Imagine it, the King of Spain, frail and drooling, spending his nights beside decaying corpses in the hope of becoming fertile. 10 years of marriage passed, 10 years of shame, failure, and despair. Then tragedy struck. Marie-Louise died suddenly at just 26. The official cause was appendicitis, but rumors flew through the court. Was she poisoned? Or had years of humiliation and hopelessness driven her to take her own life? We'll never know the truth, but one thing was certain: with her death, the dream of continuing the royal bloodline began to crumble. What history does tell us is that Charles was truly heartbroken. Despite everything, the humiliation, the pressure, the gossip, he had loved his wife deeply. Marie-Louise had been the only person who ever showed him genuine warmth, and her death left him shattered. Yet barely had her body grown cold when the court began pressuring him to remarry. The council's choice was Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess from a famously fertile family. Her parents had produced 17 children. Surely, the royal advisors reasoned, such strong blood would overcome even Charles's frail condition. But they were wrong. Maria Anna never conceived. Not once. By then, Charles's health had completely collapsed. Courtiers whispered that he looked like an old man, though he was barely 30. His once thin hair now came out in clumps. His few remaining teeth rotted and fell away, and his body trembled with every step. Some days, he couldn't even walk without being supported. Then the seizures began. Without warning, he would drop to the floor, his body convulsing violently as foam mixed with the ever-present drool on his chin. When he came to, he often failed to recognize even his closest attendants. Soon after, he began speaking of visions of spirits, ghosts, and unseen hands touching him. The royal court lived in terror. Was their king not only dying but losing his mind? The nickname El Hechizado, the Bewitched, took on chilling new meaning. Many truly believed Charles was cursed. The Spanish Inquisition was summoned. Exorcists were called in to drive out the supposed evil within him. At one point, his own confessor was accused of sorcery and thrown into prison for allegedly worsening the king's sickness through witchcraft. The entire kingdom watched in horrified fascination. Of course, no amount of exorcism could undo what was written in his bloodline. Charles's belief that he was cursed only deepened his despair. On his rare lucid days, he would break down, asking what sin had earned him such torment. He surrounded himself with amulets, relics, and holy charms, and submitted to increasingly bizarre rituals meant to purify his soul. None of it helped. His body was already doomed. His curse was genetic, carved into every cell. By age 35, Charles looked decades older. The descriptions from those who saw him are almost unbearable to read. His skin sagged over bones like a discarded cloak. His famous Habsburg jaw jutted grotesquely as the rest of his face wasted away. He was completely bald, his scalp covered with open sores. He could barely stand, shuffling a few paces before collapsing in exhaustion. His speech always slurred, and difficult had become nearly incomprehensible. But the worst was still to come. In his final years, Charles's mind completely broke down. He would sit for hours staring blankly at the wall, drool pooling on his clothes. When spoken to, he often gave no sign of hearing. Other times, he muttered nonsense about demons and angels, about his dead wife, about the children he would never have. The ruler of one of the world's greatest empires had become a ghost of a man, trapped inside a failing body. The end came in the year 1700. Charles was just 38, far from old, but his body had long since given up. He could no longer eat, even when his meals were reduced to soft mush. He couldn't stand without help. His head, swollen from hydrocephalus, caused him constant agony. On November 1st, after days of unrelenting pain, Charles II of Spain finally died, but the true horror was only revealed afterward. When the royal physicians began the autopsy, what they found defied belief. Even men hardened by years of gruesome medical work recoiled at what they saw. The official report, written in clinical Latin but laced with shock, described a body that should not have been capable of life. Charles's veins contained no blood, not a drop. His circulatory system had simply stopped functioning long before his death. His heart, they wrote, was the size of a peppercorn. Not literally that small, but shriveled, blackened, and dry. His lungs were scarred and decayed, likely from endless infections. The doctors stood in stunned silence, realizing that the man they had called king had somehow survived years longer than nature should have allowed a living miracle. Or perhaps, as many whispered, a living curse. Imagine lung tissue so corroded it resembled pumice stone rather than something meant for breathing. His intestines, described as decayed and gangrenous, had begun dying long before the rest of him. It explained the unbearable agony that haunted Charles in his final years. But the most shocking revelation, the one that confirmed what everyone had whispered but no one dared record, Charles had only one testicle, and it was black as coal. That single, lifeless remnant of tissue was all that remained of what should have been a functioning reproductive system. It's a miracle the man survived adolescence at all. And then there was his brain, the massive water-filled skull. When the physicians examined it, they found their suspicions true. His head was literally filled with fluid. The hydrocephalus had crushed nearly all usable brain tissue. How Charles managed to speak, think, or even rule, however feebly, was nothing short of medical sorcery. One can almost imagine those royal doctors, drenched in the gore of their dissection, staring down at this ruined body in disbelief that it had sustained life for 38 years. Every organ had failed. Every system was compromised. From the moment of conception, his body had been its own worst enemy. Centuries later, science would finally explain why. Geneticists uncovered the brutal truth behind this walking tragedy. Remember that inbreeding coefficient of 0.254? That means nearly 1/4 of Charles's genes were identical copies, mutations echoing through generations, spelling his destruction. Researchers now believe Charles suffered from not one, but at least 2 severe genetic disorders. The first, combined pituitary hormone deficiency, a malfunction that prevented his body from producing the hormones necessary for normal growth. It explained everything: his stunted height, his childlike features, his frailty, his infertility. His pituitary gland, the brain's hormonal command center, had failed completely. The second, distal renal tubular acidosis, a kidney disorder that wrecked his body's chemical balance. It caused the bowed legs of rickets, the muscle weakness that left him barely able to walk. and likely contributed to the swelling of his skull. Each condition was devastating on its own together. They created a slow-motion biological collapse. Add to this the infamous Habsburg jaw deformity known as mandibular prognathism. Man, you have a genetic catastrophe unparalleled in royal history. The Bourbon dynasty that succeeded them learned from this gruesome lesson. Royal marriages remained political, yes, but the reckless inbreeding that created Charles II was never repeated. The nightmare of the Habsburg jaw, the grotesque autopsy, and the story of a king who couldn't even chew his food became whispered warnings across every European court. Today, Charles II remains a case study in every genetics classroom, haunting example of what happens when bloodlines are sealed too tightly. Students learn about his inbreeding coefficient, his disorders, and his tragic anatomy. His very face has become shorthand for the dangers of genetic isolation. In an unexpected way, his suffering helped future generations understand heredity and the importance of diversity in human biology. But beyond the science and politics, there was still a man who lived each day trapped inside a body that betrayed him. He endured endless pain, humiliation, and the unbearable weight of failing his kingdom's only demand, to produce an heir. They called him the Bewitched, when in truth, his only curse was his family's obsession with purity. In his final days, too weak to hold a pen, Charles dictated one last letter. In it, he spoke not of power or politics, but of peace he hoped to find in death after a lifetime of agony. For a king who had been little more than a puppet of his bloodline, death must have felt like mercy. That portrait I mentioned earlier, it still hangs. Today, in Madrid's Museo del Prado, visitors often stop and stare, unsettled by the twisted features the court painter couldn't hide. Now, you know the truth behind that image, the jaw that could never close, the tongue that barely fit, the body that could not function, and the bloodline that became its own curse. Carlos II of Spain wasn't haunted by demons or witches. His torment came from the very roots of his family tree, a tree so entangled it strangled itself. His story stands as one of history's clearest warnings. Power might protect thrones, but it cannot protect genes. In trying to keep their empire pure, the Habsburgs sealed their doom. So the next time you see a royal portrait, remember Charles II, behind the crowns and the jewels. Remember that biology always casts the final vote, and sometimes that verdict is horrifying beyond imagination. If this story stunned you, hit that like button. The algorithm, unlike royal dynasties, rewards variety. Comment on which forgotten historical mystery you'd like to unearth next. Subscribe for more hidden truths the textbooks left behind. And remember, every time humanity embraces diversity, somewhere a Habsburg ghost breathes a sigh of relief.